The candle in your hand barely cuts through the dark. The stone walls around you sweat with cold moisture, and somewhere beneath your feet, beneath the rushes and the dried herbs scattered across the floor, something rustles in the straw. You are standing in the private chamber of a queen in the year 1350, and the air around you smells of tallow smoke, unwashed wool, and the faint sourness of bodies that have not truly been clean in months. You reach up to scratch at your scalp, and your fingers come away with something moving between them. This is not a peasant's hovel. This is the bedchamber of one of the most powerful women in England, and her hygiene, by every standard you live by today, would make you gag before you even reach the door. What you are about to learn about how queens lived, bathed, and battled filth in the 14th century will change the way you ever look at a hot shower again. Could you survive a single week without running water, without soap as you know it, without toothpaste, without toilet paper, surrounded by lice that infested even royal hair? Could you stomach a chamber that smelled of vinegar and rosewater, layered over the unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies and overflowing chamber pots? Close your eyes and imagine waking in a stone tower at dawn, the cold biting through 3 layers of wool, the taste of stale bread and sour ale in your mouth, before you have even risen from a straw-filled mattress crawling with fleas. There is something about the year 1350 that almost nobody tells you. Something that contradicts everything you assume about royalty and cleanliness. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why even a queen's skin told the story of an entire civilization fighting a war it did not know it was fighting. The year is 1350, and England has just clawed its way through the worst catastrophe in its recorded history. The Black Death arrived in 1348, and by the time it loosened its grip in 1350, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of England lay dead in mass graves, plague pits, and hastily blessed churchyards. Population estimates before the plague hover around 5 to 6 million people in England alone, and within 2 years that number collapsed by millions. Life expectancy for a commoner who survived infancy hovered around 35 years, and even for the nobility, who ate better and lived in warmer stone structures, 40 was considered a respectable old age. Society itself was arranged like a pyramid of obligation, with the king and queen at the summit, the great lords and bishops beneath them, knights and lesser gentry below that, and at the base, the overwhelming majority. The peasants and serfs who tilled the land in exchange for protection and the right to exist. Queen Philippa of Hainaut, wife of King Edward III, sat near the very top of this pyramid in 1350, a woman renowned for her generosity and her patronage of scholars. Yet even she could not escape the universal medieval truth that hygiene as a science simply did not exist yet. Across the channel, physicians like Gilbertus Anglicus, the Englishman whose medical Compendium Medicinae, circulated among the literate elite, prescribed treatments rooted in the belief that disease traveled through bad air, called miasma, rather than through the filth that coated nearly every surface a person touched. The hierarchy mattered enormously for hygiene because access to clean linen, perfumed water, and private latrines was a luxury reserved almost exclusively for those at the top. Yet even that luxury was a thin veneer stretched over conditions that would horrify anyone alive today. Picture the queen rising before dawn in her chamber at Windsor or Eltham. There is no running water anywhere in the castle. A servant brings a basin of water that has been heated over a fire, and this water is used to wash only the hands and the face, because the medieval mind genuinely believed that submerging the entire body in water opened the pores and invited disease straight into the bloodstream. Full body bathing for anyone, even royalty, happened perhaps a handful of times a year. And after the plague struck, bathing became even rarer because physicians began warning that hot water softened the skin and made it more vulnerable to the poisonous air believed to carry pestilence. You would have gone months, sometimes the better part of a year, without ever submerging your body in water. Instead, the queen and her ladies relied on what was called dry washing, rubbing the skin with linen cloths, sometimes scented with rosewater, lavender, or crushed herbs, to absorb oil and grime without the supposed danger of open water. Beneath her elaborate gowns against bare skin, the queen wore a linen undergarment called a chemise, and this single garment did the heaviest lifting in the entire hygiene system of the era. The chemise absorbed sweat, oil, and odor, and it was changed far more frequently than anyone bathed, sometimes every few days for the wealthy, because clean linen against the skin was considered the true marker of cleanliness, not water itself. Laundresses boiled these linens in lye made from wood ash and animal fat, a harsh, skin-cracking process that nonetheless represented one of the few genuinely effective sanitary practices of the age. Now picture her hair. Queen Philippa's hair, like that of every woman of her station, was almost never washed with anything resembling shampoo. Instead, servants used fine-toothed combs, often carved from bone or boxwood, to physically drag lice and their eggs, called nits, out of the scalp strand by strand. Lice were not a sign of poverty in the 14th century. They were a universal condition of being alive, and archaeological digs at medieval sites consistently find delicate bone combs buried alongside the remains of even the wealthiest individuals. Proof that nobody, not king, nor queen, nor bishop, escaped the crawling itch of parasites in their hair. Surviving household accounts from noble English families list payments to servants specifically tasked with delousing, and some records even mention special combs reserved exclusively for the lady of the house, suggesting an awareness of infestation so constant it required dedicated staff. Beyond lice, fleas thrived in the straw-filled mattresses, the woolen hangings, and the rush-strewn floors of every castle in England, biting through the night regardless of a person's title. The rushes themselves, sweet-smelling herbs like meadow sweet and lavender scattered across stone floors to mask odor and cushion footsteps, were changed only occasionally, meaning that beneath the fresh top layer often lay weeks of accumulated filth, spilled food, animal droppings from hunting dogs allowed indoors, and human waste from careless visitors, all quietly rotting beneath fragrant herbs that fooled the nose but did nothing for the body. Consider the matter of teeth. There was no toothbrush as you know it. The wealthy chewed on hazel twigs, frayed at one end into crude bristles, or rubbed their teeth with a cloth dipped in salt, wine, or crushed herbs like mint and sage. Sugar was an extraordinarily expensive imported luxury in 1350, meaning the wealthy, who could actually afford it, often suffered worse tooth decay than peasants who survived on coarse bread and vegetables. Surviving medieval skeletons of aristocrats frequently show abscesses, severe decay, and teeth worn down to painful stumps, and toothache was treated with remedies as bizarre as drilling into the offending tooth, applying heated metal to numb the area, or packing the cavity with a paste of herbs and sometimes crushed insects. Bad breath, called fetor oris in period medical texts, was simply an accepted feature of close conversation, masked as best as possible with cloves, mint leaves, or sips of wine, never cured at the source. Now turn to the most intimate and most overlooked aspect of castle life, the toilet itself. Castles like Windsor contained small stone alcoves called garderobes, essentially a stone seat positioned over a long vertical shaft that dropped waste directly into the moat, a cesspit, or sometimes simply the outer wall of the castle below. Imagine sitting on cold stone in the dead of winter, wind howling up through the shaft directly against your bare skin, the smell of centuries of accumulated waste rising to meet you. There was no toilet paper. Depending on your station, you used handfuls of hay, moss, leaves, or, for the truly wealthy, scraps of wool or linen, which were then discarded or, in some recorded cases, among the extremely poor, rinsed and reused. The garderobe's name itself, meaning to guard one's robes, came from the practice of hanging clothing inside these foul-smelling chambers, because the ammonia, rich fumes from accumulated urine, were believed, correctly as it turns out, to kill moths and lice that infested fabric. Queen Philippa's own garderobe would have connected to a shaft eventually emptied by servants called gong farmers. men whose entire profession involved removing solid waste from cesspits by hand, work so universally reviled that they were often only permitted to operate at night and were sometimes legally barred from certain town gates during daylight hours. The irony is staggering when you consider it. The Queen's waste traveled through stone built by master masons, past tapestries worth more than entire villages, yet ended in the same fundamental disposal system as that of the lowest serf, gravity, and a hole in the ground. Menstruation presented its own brutal challenge inside the castle walls. Women of every class managed monthly bleeding with folded linen rags, washed and reused repeatedly, with no reliable disposal method beyond burning or burying. Medical texts of the period, drawing on ancient humor theory inherited from Galen and Hippocrates, describe menstrual blood as a poisonous excess the female body needed to purge, and some physicians genuinely believed that menstruating women's gaze could spoil mirrors or sour milk. The Queen, despite her status, navigated this monthly reality with the same rags, the same discomfort, and the same lack of any pain relief beyond herbal teas made from chamomile, mugwort, or pennyroyal. Herbs whose efficacy ranged from mildly soothing to genuinely dangerous if taken in excess. Childbirth multiplied every hygienic horror tenfold. When a queen went into labor, she retired to a specially prepared birthing chamber, windows often covered and air kept deliberately warm and close, based on the belief that cold air endangered both mother and child. Midwives, never university-trained physicians, who were almost universally male and rarely present at births, managed the entire process using hands that had, by any modern standard, never been adequately washed, working amid linens soaked in blood, sweat, and amniotic fluid that could not be properly sanitized between uses. Puerperal fever, an infection caused by exactly the kind of unsanitary conditions present in every birthing chamber of the era, killed mothers across every social class with horrifying regularity, and infant mortality in the 14th century is estimated at somewhere between 30 and 50% before the age of 5, meaning a queen giving birth faced odds that would terrify any modern parent. Queen Philippa herself bore 13 children across her marriage to Edward III, and several of them died young, a grief she shared with mothers across every rung of the social ladder, proof that the plague of poor hygiene respected no crown. Skin conditions tell their own visceral story. Scabies, caused by microscopic mites burrowing into the skin, was so common it was simply called the itch, and treated with sulfur ointments that burned as much as they soothed. Boils, abscesses, and weeping sores appeared regularly, even among the nobility, treated with poultices of bread, milk, herbs, or in more desperate cases, the application of leeches to draw out what physicians believed was corrupted blood. Bloodletting itself was performed regularly as a preventative health measure, not merely a treatment, meaning the Queen's own physicians likely opened her veins on a routine schedule based on lunar phases and astrological charts, draining blood from a body already weakened by poor diet variety, despite the abundance of meat and bread available to her, because medieval nutrition, even at its richest, lacked the balanced vitamins your modern body takes for granted. Now picture an actual scene unfolding inside Windsor Castle on a winter evening in 1350. The Queen sits near a smoking hearth, her ladies in waiting arranged around her on cushioned stools, a basin of rosewater nearby for the ritual washing of hands before the evening meal is served. A servant girl, no older than 12, kneels by the Queen's feet with a small bone comb, working silently through strands of hair, occasionally pausing to crush something between her fingernails. Outside the thick stone walls, snow falls over a courtyard, where dogs root through frozen mud for scraps, and somewhere below in the depths of the castle, a gong farmer empties a cesspit by torchlight because the smell during daylight hours had become unbearable to passers-by. The Queen reaches for a small pouch of dried lavender and presses it briefly to her nose before continuing her conversation about a matter of court diplomacy, utterly unbothered by an itch beneath her left arm that she has long since learned to ignore. This was not deprivation in her mind. This was simply how the world smelled, how bodies felt, how every single day unfolded for every person she had ever known. The consequences of this universal lack of hygiene rippled across every level of society and shaped the entire trajectory of medieval life expectancy. Diseases spread by lice, particularly typhus, killed indiscriminately. And fleas carried on rats were the very mechanism by which the Black Death itself had annihilated a third of Europe just 2 years before this story takes place. Dysentery and other waterborne illnesses spread through contaminated wells and rivers used simultaneously for drinking, washing, and waste disposal, killed thousands annually with what we would now recognize as entirely preventable infections. Infant mortality remained catastrophically high precisely because newborns, delivered into unsanitary birthing chambers and handled by unwashed hands, had no immune resistance to the bacteria swarming every surface they touched. The irony at the absolute center of this entire period is brutal in its simplicity. The very practices believed to protect health, the avoidance of water, the belief in miasma over microbes, the trust in bloodletting over rest, actively accelerated the spread of the diseases people feared most. Medieval physicians were not foolish men. They were working with the best theoretical framework available to them, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, and they had no concept of germs, no microscope, no understanding that the invisible world crawling across every surface was the true enemy, not bad smells drifting on cursed winds. And yet, despite every horror described here, the people of 1350, queen and peasant alike, were not merely victims cowering in filth. They built entire systems of herbal medicine that, centuries later, modern pharmacology would validate as genuinely effective. Willow bark for pain relief, the same compound later synthesized into aspirin, garlic for its real antimicrobial properties, and honey, which modern science now confirms has natural antibacterial qualities, used to dress wounds across medieval Europe. Queen Philippa herself was known as a patron of learning, supporting scholars and founding what would become Queen's College at Oxford. Proof that even amid universal filth, the medieval mind pursued knowledge, beauty, and meaning with extraordinary determination. Castle life included music played on lutes and harps in the evening, elaborate feasts celebrating saints' days, embroidery work of staggering skill stitched by candlelight, and a deep communal faith that gave structure and comfort against the constant presence of death. These people laughed, fell in love, raised children with fierce devotion, and found genuine joy in small comforts: a warm fire, a cup of spiced wine, a song remembered from childhood, even as their bodies carried parasites and their air carried odors that would make a modern person retch within seconds. Here is the secret hiding inside this entire grim portrait. The very filth and disease that defined 1350 became, centuries later, the spark that ignited modern hygiene science. The catastrophic death toll of the Black Death and the repeated waves of plague that followed it forced European thinkers, eventually, centuries later, to question miasma theory entirely. The eventual rise of germ theory in the 19th century, championed by scientists like Louis Pasteur, did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged because humanity had spent 500 years accumulating catastrophic evidence that something invisible, something beyond bad smells, was killing people in horrifyingly predictable patterns. Every plague pit dug in 1350, every queen scratching at lice in her own hair, every gong farmer emptying waste by torchlight became an unwitting data point in a centuries-long experiment that eventually produced soap as you know it, sanitation systems, antibiotics, and the simple hot shower you likely take for granted every single morning. When you turn that shower handle tomorrow and feel clean water rush over your skin, remember Queen Philippa, sitting beside her smoking hearth, pressing lavender to her nose, utterly unaware that the world she lived in, filthy, fragrant with herbs masking decay, infested despite every layer of silk and fur, was quietly laying the groundwork for the comfort you now consider an absolute baseline of human dignity. The contrast between her reality and yours is not a small one. It is the difference between disease as an accepted condition of existence and disease as something you can prevent with a bar of soap costing less than a cup of coffee. If this kind of story pulled you in, if you are the kind of person who has always sensed that the past held truths far stranger and far more human than anything a textbook ever offered you, then you already understand exactly why this channel exists. We dig past polished portraits and the romanticized castles to show you what life actually felt like, smelled like, and cost the people who lived it. And there is so much more waiting for you. Stories about plague doctors, about famine, about the brutal mechanics of medieval warfare and survival that most people will never take the time to learn. Subscribing means you will never miss the next piece of this hidden history. And if this story moved you even a little, a like helps more people discover it, and sharing it with someone who loves history as much as you do costs nothing, but might just change how they see the past forever. The Queen's chamber has long since crumbled to dust, but the lessons written into her itching scalp and her unwashed skin became the quiet foundation of every modern comfort you now consider beneath notice. And that is the strange, humbling truth history rarely tells you out loud.